There was a time when the mountains held secrets and the forests whispered stories of courage and survival. In a land where green hills touched the clouds and mist danced between ancient trees, there lived a man named Rajan who had spent many years serving his country as a soldier. Rajan was now in his 50s with gray threading through his dark hair and lines etched deep around his eyes from squinting at distant horizons. He had seen much in his life, perhaps too much, and now he found himself in these remote mountains doing what he knew best, protecting a border that few civilians ever thought about. The year was moving toward its end and the cold was beginning to settle into the valleys like an old friend returning home. Rajan was a sniper, trained to wait, trained to watch, trained to make decisions that weighed heavily on the soul. He carried his rifle with the ease of long familiarity and wore a ghillie suit that made him blend into the landscape like a shadow or a whisper. His camp was simple, a small outpost shared with a few other soldiers who rotated duties and kept watch over the strategic bar, a narrow passage through the mountains that had seen conflict throughout history. Among his companions was young Arjun, barely in his 20s, with eager eyes and quick hands, who reminded Rajan of himself decades ago when the world seemed full of clear answers and simple choices. There was also Prakash, a quiet man in his 40s who spoke little but noticed everything and whose presence was steady like the mountains themselves. And there was their commanding officer, Captain Sharma, a man who carried responsibility like a heavy coat and made decisions that none of them envied. The days passed slowly in the mountains, where time moved differently than in the cities below. Rajan would wake before dawn when the world was still gray and the birds had not yet begun their songs. He would check his equipment with practiced hands, running through routines so familiar they required no thought. Then he would move to his position high on a ridge where he could see the valley below and the bar, the passage that enemies might use to infiltrate. The waiting was the hardest part, always had been. Hours would stretch into days and days into weeks with nothing but the wind and the occasional call of an eagle for company. But Rajan had learned patience over the years, had learned to quiet his mind and find peace in the stillness. He would think about his village far away, where his wife Meera tended their small garden and waited for his letters. He thought about his daughter Priya, who was now married with children of her own, children he saw too rarely. He thought about the choices that had brought him to these mountains and whether they had been the right ones. One morning, as autumn was giving way to winter, Rajan spotted movement in the valley below. Through his scope he could see figures moving carefully through the forest, trying to use the terrain for cover. They were enemy combatants, he could tell from their equipment and the way they moved with military precision toward the bar. His heart began to beat faster, not with fear but with the familiar surge of adrenaline that came with action after long periods of waiting. He radioed the information to Captain Sharma, who gave orders to observe and prepare. The next hours were tense as the enemy group made their way closer to the strategic passage. Rajan watched them through his scope, counting their numbers, noting their weapons, trying to understand their intentions. There were 5 of them moving in formation, with one man taking point and another bringing up the rear. As they came within range, Rajan steadied his breathing and prepared to follow whatever orders came. But then something unexpected happened. The lead figure stumbled and fell, and the others rushed to help him. Through his scope, Rajan could see that the man was injured, his leg bleeding from what looked like an old wound that had reopened. The group was in disarray now, their military precision giving way to concern and confusion. One of them was trying to bandage the injured man's leg while the others kept watch, scanning the hills nervously. Rajan found himself watching, not as a sniper calculating shots but as a man observing other men. He could see their faces now, young faces mostly, with fear and determination mixed in equal measure. They reminded him of soldiers he had known over the years, of Arjun and Prakash and even himself. They were someone's sons, someone's brothers, perhaps someone's fathers. The injured man was clearly in pain, his face contorted as his companions tried to help him. Rajan watched as they argued among themselves, probably debating whether to continue or turn back. Captain Sharma's voice came through the radio asking for status and recommendations. Rajan hesitated a moment that stretched longer than it should have. He reported what he saw, the injury, the confusion, the fact that the group seemed to be reconsidering their advance. The captain asked if he had a clear shot. Rajan confirmed that he did. The order came through measured and clear, as military orders always were. Rajan was to engage if the enemy continued toward the bar. He acknowledged the order and returned to watching. The group below had made a decision. They were fashioning a makeshift stretcher from branches and fabric, preparing to carry their injured companion. But instead of advancing toward the bar, they began moving back the way they had come. Slowly, painfully, they retreated into the forest, carrying their wounded friend between them. Rajan kept his scope trained on them, following their progress until they disappeared into the trees. He radioed the information to Captain Sharma, reporting that the enemy had withdrawn. There was a pause on the other end of the radio and then acknowledgement. No shots had been fired. The mountains returned to their silence. That evening back at the outpost, Rajan sat with Arjun and Prakash, sharing tea that had been brewed strong and sweet the way soldiers liked it. Arjun was excited, talking about the day's events and how ready he had been for action. Prakash listened quietly, as was his way, occasionally nodding or adding a soft comment. Rajan found himself unusually reflective. He told them a story about a time many years ago when he had been a young soldier like Arjun, full of certainty about right and wrong, friend and enemy. He had been in a similar situation then, watching enemy soldiers through his scope. But that time he had followed orders and taken the shot. He had been decorated for it, later told. He had prevented a potential attack and saved lives. But the face of the man in his scope had never quite left him. It returned sometimes in quiet moments, reminding him that every target was also a person with a story, with people who loved them, with dreams that would never be fulfilled. Arjun listened with wide eyes, perhaps beginning to understand that war was more complicated than the stories made it seem. Prakash nodded slowly, his eyes distant with memories of his own. Captain Sharma joined them later and they sat together in companionable silence, watching the stars emerge in the clear mountain sky. The captain mentioned that intelligence suggested the enemy group they had observed had been on a reconnaissance mission. Their withdrawal likely meant the mission was aborted, at least for now. He looked at Rajan for a long moment, and though no words were spoken, there was understanding between them. The mountains had taught them both that sometimes the hardest decisions were about when not to act. As winter deepened, Rajan continued his duties with the same dedication and skill he had always shown. He watched the valleys and the passes. He kept his equipment ready. He followed his orders. But something had shifted inside him, a quiet recognition that after all these years he was not just a soldier but a guardian. His role was not just to eliminate threats but to protect life, to hold a line that prevented greater violence. There was wisdom in restraint and knowing that every action had consequences that rippled outward in ways no one could fully predict. He wrote longer letters to Meera now, telling her things he had never found words for before. He wrote to Priya asking about his grandchildren and telling her how proud he was of the life she had built. He began to see his time in these mountains not as exile or duty but as a kind of meditation, a place where the distractions of the world fell away and what remained was essential. The winter brought snow that painted the mountains white and made the forests look like something from a dream. Rajan would sometimes pause in his rounds to simply observe the beauty around him. He noticed how the light changed throughout the day, how the shadows moved across the valleys, how the wind carried different sounds depending on its direction. Arjun grew quieter as the months passed, less eager in his speech, more thoughtful in his observations. Prakash continued his steady presence, a reminder that strength did not always need to be loud. Captain Sharma led them with wisdom earned through years of service, making decisions that balanced duty with humanity. One evening, as they sat around a small fire, Arjun asked Rajan how he managed to stay calm, how he dealt with the weight of his responsibilities. Rajan was quiet for a long time before answering. He said that he had learned that life was precious, all life, and that protecting it sometimes meant difficult choices. He said that courage was not just about facing danger but about facing yourself, about being honest about the cost of your actions. He said that in the end what mattered was not the decorations or the recognition but whether you could live with yourself, whether you could look in the mirror and recognize the person looking back. Arjun nodded slowly, beginning to understand. Prakash added softly that they were all doing their best, that none of them were perfect but that trying to do right even when it was hard was what defined them. Captain Sharma listened and then said simply that he was proud to serve with such men. The fire crackled and the stars wheeled overhead, and for a moment everything felt right. As the seasons continued their eternal cycle, Rajan knew that his time in the mountains would eventually end. He would return to his village, to Meera and her garden, to Priya and his grandchildren. He would carry these mountains with him always, their lessons written in his heart. He had learned that kindness was not weakness, that seeing the humanity in others, even enemies, was not betrayal but wisdom. He had learned that the true mark of a warrior was knowing when to show mercy. He had learned that life was full of gray areas that required judgment and compassion in equal measure. And he had learned that in the end we are all connected, all making our way through this world, trying to do our best with the understanding we have. The mountains stood eternal witnesses to human struggles and human growth. They had seen countless soldiers come and go, each one carrying their own stories, their own burdens, their own moments of choice. And they would continue to stand long after Rajan and his companions had gone, offering their quiet lessons to anyone willing to listen. In the years that followed, Rajan would sometimes tell his grandchildren stories about his time in the mountains. He would tell them about the beauty of dawn breaking over the peaks, about the camaraderie of soldiers who become like family, and sometimes late at night when they were old enough to understand, he would tell them about a day when he watched enemy soldiers carry their wounded friend away, about a choice to hold fire, about understanding that came with age and experience, about the kind of courage that had nothing to do with pulling a trigger. His grandchildren would listen with serious faces, beginning to understand that their grandfather was not just a soldier but a man who had learned hard lessons and chosen to be guided by compassion. And Rajan would hope that they too would find their way to kindness, that they would learn to see others as fully human, that they would choose understanding over hate, because in the end that was the only way forward, the only way to break cycles of violence, the only way to build a world worth living in. The mountains had taught him that, and it was perhaps the most important lesson of all.